Now, I promise I didn't choose to do a 2-week Christmas in July summer mini so that I could just go back in my files of old Christmas Eve sermons and pull out an old sermon from years to make life a little easier for me this summer. That being said, on Christmas Eve in 2022, I shared one of my favorite Christmas reflections with you all in my sermon, saying, "So from generation to generation, we tell this story of Christmas, not just a story of a Merry Christmas, but Christmas with all its highs, lows, and in-betweens. Because while we say Merry Christmas this night and offer a human wish for happiness and contentment for one another in this sacred time, this story of Christmas opens wide to say that no matter if this time is merry and bright for you and your family or not, Christmas is no mere wish. It is God's promise to us that I am with you and I am making all things new. Through the highest of highs and the great joys of the human experience, God is with us. Through the great sorrows, on the days when we are not merry, when we bear great pain that is known to all and held in community, or when we bear deep grief silently in our hearts and merriment seems such a distant hope, we tell this story of Christmas as a steadfast promise to us and every generation that God is here. God has not forsaken us. God loves you as you are and is calling you to know abundant life here and now." Okay, that's it. I promise. I'm not just rehashing an old sermon. But I really do love that sentiment about Christmas and have shared it with many folks in many contexts. Merry is a human wish, a hope that this special season is indeed special for you. But Christmas is God's promise to us and is true no matter the circumstances of a season or a life. So it is with that understanding, dear friends, that I can, with all confidence and unimpeachable liturgical resolve, say to you today in the heat and humidity of July, when it's going to be 90-ish throughout this week, and our paraments once again herald common time across the church, Merry Christmas. This familiar story from Luke 2 that we've heard today is no less true because it's hot outside. Christmas is a promise that meets us even now. It's the promise that God is with us, that God meets us in our day-to-day life, and that God meets us in the extraordinary events like those that surrounded the shepherds, and in the ordinary everyday places like a feeding trough in the living room of the home without room in the visitor lodging. And this whole idea of Christmas in July, with singing these hymns out of season, and Christmas cookouts as a community, and beach scenes on our bulletin cover, and even maybe the wandering thoughts of someone in here that's thinking of Santa getting a tan on a beach somewhere rather than sugar plums dancing through your heads. It might all sound silly, might all seem perfectly unserious, and like maybe the associate pastor has fully run amok with the senior pastor on vacation. And that's all true. It is unserious in its own way to celebrate Christmas this week, but I offer you, dear church, the simultaneous truth that it is an entirely serious thing for us to celebrate Christmas in this time as well. The Christmas season each winter can become so easily busy, overfilled even with wonderful things like family gatherings and Christmas programs, the end of a busy semester, obligations to get together for parties, and the sometimes crushing burden placed on us by the world outside these walls to fill the season with more and more gift buying and stress. But then we gather on Christmas Eve and we hear a story that is anything but that. It seems so separate from the rush of the season around it. There's an urgency to the story of Christmas, but it's in regards to bringing the Prince of Peace safely into this world, and not about buying the latest and hottest toy. The Messiah's birth heralds glad tidings from heaven, but doesn't obligate us to write and sign meaningful and personalized Christmas cards to everybody we know. So what a serious gift it is, dear church, to gather in this time, perhaps a little sweatier, but less burdened by all the trappings of the season, to reflect seriously on this story of Christmas. Because the incarnation of Christ, God showing up for us in a flesh and blood body that could live, feed, eat, teach, and die, is seriously central to our whole life together. Emmanuel, God with us, the Messiah who brings salvation to all creation, is transformative and life-giving stuff. Through water, word, and meal, we gather in this promise each week that God is here, and the incarnation continues to be a real event in our time, just as real as it was when that baby was laid in a manger. The incarnation is not something we can take for granted, as to do so would be to neglect the ways that this promise of Messiah points us to a God who is continuously transforming our lives and our community through the gift of grace. I read this week that in his book, The Different Drum, the renowned psychiatrist and spiritual writer M. Scott Peck tells of a fable of an old monastery that was facing imminent closure. As the 5 remaining monks were elderly and there were no signs of interest from younger generations. Distraught about the coming death of his community, the abbot sought advice from a friend, a neighboring rabbi, who replied to his conundrum, "I have no advice to give. The only thing I can tell you is that the Messiah is one of you." The confused abbot returns home and shares this curious message with his fellow monks. They spend the next several months ruminating on this idea. Which of us could be the Messiah? Is it him? Is it me? Slowly they begin to think differently about each other, about the qualities each one exhibits. As they do, they begin to treat each other and each one himself with the respect they would give to the Messiah. In the following months and years, visitors to the monastery's grounds noticed a change in the atmosphere. They began to seek the counsel of the wise elderly monks. Young men began to ask if they could join, all thanks to the rabbi's gift. Now, this may sound like a weird or even unnecessarily accusatory question. I certainly don't mean it to say you've done anything wrong. But hearing this story, I wonder, how would our lives and our community be transformed if we took Christmas seriously? I know we do take Christmas seriously. We have so many rich traditions, the fond memories in ourselves and our community, and December is full of intentional efforts to celebrate Christmas well and faithfully. You each do that well here at Muhlenberg. But I'm asking, what if we took Christmas seriously? Took the incarnation seriously? This radical idea that the Messiah was born among us, that Emmanuel, God with us, is still remarkably with us. What if we take this baby in a manger at his grown-up word that he will be with us always, even to the end of the age, and lived like Christmas couldn't just be contained to the bleak midwinter, but was a foundational promise of hope for every single day of our life? What if we took these hot summer days to say Merry Christmas to others and in our own hearts, and see the Messiah in our neighbor's face and our own? Not just in some theological thought experiment, a feel-good idea of Messiah that fits neatly on a Christmas card, but seriously consider Christ really enfleshed, living among us still. Would we find our lives transformed, like the monks who focused on the reality of Messiah rather than the fear of their own demise? Would we be more generous, loving, compassionate, slow to anger, and gracious with ourselves and others if we took seriously the promise that God is with us, that the Messiah is sitting in the pew with us, and hungry by the roadside, and ill in the hospital, and makes a long and dangerous journey to find safety in our community as a refugee, and looks back at us in the mirror? I believe we would. And that is part of the way that the Spirit of God, through incarnation, continues to transform us. The monks in that story took Christmas seriously, not just the season of Christmas time. and their lives, monastery, and wider community were transformed by the presence of the living Christ. We can be so serious about our Christmas traditions each winter, but I fear that the steadfast regularity of those traditions can lull us into a false sense of complacency surrounding the mind-blowing, world-transforming reality of the incarnation which we celebrate. So I'm delighted to take some seemingly unserious time this summer to celebrate Christmas in July, that we might remind ourselves here in the heat and humidity that it matters for us to take incarnation seriously. God is with us, and the promise and implications of that are overflowing into this very moment. The only thing I can tell you is that the Messiah is one of you, the rabbi said. The implications of the incarnation is that Christ is with us now. That is taking Christmas seriously. Seriously considering what it means to say that we are made one body through the waters of holy baptism, that we are united to his own body and blood through the feast of everlasting life, and that as the word is proclaimed, the living Christ walks through the assembly preaching and teaching once more. That's serious Christmas. Someone else who took Christmas seriously was our dear friend Martin Luther, who said in his 1530 Christmas sermon, "There are many of you in this congregation who think to yourselves, if only I had been there. How quick I would have been to help the baby. I would have washed his linen. How happy I would have been to go with the shepherds to see the Lord lying in the manger." Yes, you would. You say that because you know how great Christ is. But if you had been there at that time, you would have done no better than the people of Bethlehem. Childish and silly thoughts are these. Why don't you do it now? You have Christ in your neighbor. You ought to serve him. For what you do to your neighbor in need, you do to the Lord Christ himself. I'm always grateful for Luther's directness and lack of subtlety, but especially during Christmas in July. Christmas is a promise from God to each of us that we don't have to be theoretical or intellectual about our faith. We can know God in the Word, in relationship with one another, in caring for our neighbor in need, in seeing the divine image in ourselves as we look at our reflection in the mirror, and in our neighbor who, like Christ, became a refugee in the face of political and community violence, and in every other neighbor beyond that. This is Christmas, lived out every day, in flesh and blood, in need and abundance, hungry and satisfied, embodied and real all around us, all year long. Can we be as serious as the monks of this story who see the Messiah in one another and find that their community is enlivened with new hope? Can we be as serious as the shepherds in the field who overcame their fear and trembling in the presence of the angels to rush to the manger to see this wondrous thing? Can we be so serious about Christmas that we're willing to not just wish merriment for one another 1 month of the year, but rather embody God's promise of incarnation for one another by showing up in love to bear the presence of Christ to those who are hurting, lonely, or afraid? Can we say Merry Christmas to one another in July, not just as a silly or fun thing to do while the senior pastor's on vacation, but as a genuine promise of love and solidarity to one another that is rooted in the very nature of God? Dear friends, I believe in my heart that a church who takes Christmas seriously is one who's transformed, gracious, and equipped to see the Messiah among us, to be the Messiah's hands and feet for one another, and to live into the Messiah's hope forever. Taking this gift of Christmas seriously, dear church, let us follow the lead of our beloved Mary and spend some time, even in these summer days, treasuring all these words and pondering them in our hearts. Amen.